Welcome to Data and the Greater Good. I'm Elaine Gamble. I'm the community leader for Data and the Greater Good, where our focus is the use of data in mission-driven organizations, so education, healthcare, the arts, volunteerism, environmentalism. Organizations come and talk to us about how data is used to advance their mission and to bring more value to their audiences. We are honored to have with us tonight Rebecca Widom from DonorsChoose, Director of Data Science and Analytics, who will talk with us about how DonorsChoose has been supporting teachers during the COVID-19 distance learning and what they've learned in general during this time. To tell you a little bit more about DonorsChoose and Rebecca, DonorsChoose is the leading platform for giving to public schools. Teachers across the United States use DonorsChoose to request funding for various projects. They submit projects, and those projects are funded by donors who are intrigued by the nature of the project. It was founded in 2000 by Charles Best, a history teacher. And since that time, more than 4 million people have donated to DonorsChoose projects. Over $900 million has been donated, and over 1 million projects have been supported. Everything from books to butterfly cocoons to robotics kits, Little House on the Prairie, all bringing more resources to the classroom where they're needed most. When it comes to learning, the connection between the teacher and the student is precious. And these COVID-19 times have presented some very unique challenges in distance learning for teachers. Nonetheless, the resilience of teachers has been stronger than ever, and the commitment of DonorsChoose has been stronger than ever in supporting teachers. Along with tangible support for teachers adapting to new circumstances, donations are bringing much needed moments of joy, comfort, care, happiness to everyone, and supporting academic excellence during this time. We're honored to have with us tonight Rebecca Widom, Director of Data Science and Analytics for DonorsChoose. Rebecca leads the data team at DonorsChoose, providing analytics infrastructure and data science for the organization. She's a graduate of MIT, having completed their program in women's studies, and since that time has been on a lifelong path for data for good. Before we go into the heart of her talk, first we want to thank Bill Prickett from Prickett Media for coordinating this virtual experience for us. Bill, thank you so much for that. And he is also video recording tonight's session. If you have questions for Rebecca as she's speaking, you can type them into the chat, or you can type your name or the question. And when it's time for Q&A, I will call on you to share your question with the group. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Widom, Director of Data Science and Analytics for DonorsChoose. And Rebecca, it is truly an honor to have you with us this evening. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Elaine, and it's a great honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this work, which is, very much ongoing. I'm relatively new to the organization. I came to work at DonorsChoose in November, so everything I'm going to talk about is informed by my perspective from other organizations and what I'm seeing at this new one. DonorsChoose's mission is we make it easy for anyone to help a classroom in need, moving us closer to a nation where students in every community have the tools and experiences they need for a great education. That's what the team has been working on for decades. And we've been excited in recent months. A few different academics have found, using not randomized control trials, but sort of the closest next thing, statistically speaking, that funding small projects identified needs from teachers at the front lines really does make a measurable impact in schools and in student achievement. So we've been very gratified to see that recently. Okay, so I think you also may have, some of you who've been with the group for longer may have seen my colleague, Stephen Burke, who spoke a year ago. So I'm not going to do, and Elaine did such a wonderful introduction, I'm not going to say too much more about DonorsChoose. I'm going to dive into the data. All right, so data at DonorsChoose. So this is a blog post from my predecessor, Barb, and she did an amazing job really building the power across the org of people to analyze data and providing infrastructure to them. And I heard about this great, everyone is engaged with data all the time, but I just by nature am a little bit skeptical. So when I got to DonorsChoose in November, I looked at the data. We have a business intelligence tool called Looker, which is the main way that people across the organization visualize data. And so I just looked at, in that month, November, how many people were using the tool, right? And for how much time. And so you can see week to week, it's 90, 100 people, except Thanksgiving, right? And that's out of a staff of maybe 150 people. So I had actually never seen that rate of usage of a business intelligence tool at having worked at a bunch of different organizations. So I felt like, okay, like this is real. This is not just talk about everyone is engaged with the data, right? And really it just scratches the surface. Like in addition to using this tool, we have Slack channels where people are supporting each other and asking questions. And so there really was a strong data culture when I got to DonorsChoose. So then that raises the question, what could I do and what could today's data team do to add the most value, given that data was being used so actively across the organization? And so I think our work as a team falls into 3 buckets. So one is data and analytics engineering, providing those tools to the people across the organization who want to do their own data analysis. One is machine learning, so finding ways that we can use machine learning algorithms to make the product itself, the website itself, more effective for teachers and donors. And the last is data analysis. So when there are questions that might be a little more difficult to answer or more complicated than people who are not full-time data people want to take on, then our team can step in those moments. So I'm going to talk first about the data and analytics engineering. This is a refrigerator. It is full of stuff. I'm sure you all have refrigerators at home, and when we used to work in offices, we probably had a refrigerator in our office as well. There's an economist, well, she's passed away, but Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in economics for her research into effective management of shared resources. So one such shared resource is an office refrigerator. Another is a business intelligence or an analytics system for an organization. So a lot of people across the organization have all different kinds of questions, all different kinds of things they want to know, but there is a sort of fixed resource in a central data system, a central data warehouse like we have. And so one of the things that I noticed when I arrived at DonorsChoose, in addition to the amazing engagement, right, was a former boss of mine used to say, your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. And so there was a lot in our system of, Sally's list of donors from 2012, who she wanted to be able to compare to a different list of donors to see what happened with a project she was working on then, which is great. And I want the Sallys and the Joes and all of these people across the organization to be able to do those kinds of projects. It's really exciting, really important work. And over time, the system became difficult to navigate because there were so many of those things that the people who were coming to it new today didn't know what they were or how to navigate it, and having to sift through that stuff was kind of difficult. So one of the ways that I think today's team can add value is finding ways to meet both needs, to be flexible and allow people to do the analyses that they really want to do without leaving moldy things in our analytics refrigerator. I'm going to come back to the list of donor IDs later in this conversation, but I want to just give an overview of the tools that we use to make this a reality. So in the top row is sources of our data, right? So at the far left is Postgres. That's the database that's behind our website. That's our main, most important source of data. The next is Salesforce. We use Salesforce to track and manage our relationships with partners, big donors. Our help desk uses Zendesk. And Amazon S3 stores all kinds of other data sets that we might bring in from vendors or other places. And we use a tool called Fivetran in the middle of the screen to bring together, to basically pull data out of all of those systems and make it available in Redshift. Looker is the tool that our colleagues across the organization use to analyze data primarily. Heap is a way of tracking clickstream, more details on how people are using the site, and that data comes directly into Redshift. And then since I've been with the organization, we've been working more with Simon data and with DBT. So Simon data is an email platform that allows our email marketing team to more seamlessly integrate a group that they might identify using Looker, for example, and then have the same system just send emails to those people. In getting Simon data up and running, we've transitioned to Simon data within the last 6 months, so it's relatively new, but there are 20 new automated emails which are bringing in millions of dollars each year, and it has vastly reduced the need for this workload of downloading data from Looker and uploading it into an email provider. DBT is a tool that allows us to massage data and sort of make it more ready for analysis and also more ready for integration for use with other tools like Simon data. That's literally sort of new in the last 2 months. So to be continued, but those are things we're working on at the moment. Okay, so that was the analytics piece. Now I'm going to talk about machine learning. And I'm going to start with a tale of two tablets. Teachers, particularly today, right, want to get tablets for their students to use for a variety of purposes. And some funders want to fund tablets and some don't, right? And part of our job is to make it easy for people to find the projects that appeal to them, that they want to support in schools, right? So we want to be able to group together projects that are asking for the same kinds of resources. And that is more complicated than it might seem. So when we're trying to group together things like a Samsung Galaxy tablet, which is categorized as a tablet by Best Buy, versus a Microsoft Surface Go burgundy type cover, which might show up under basics and some kind of holsters and sleep, like, right, sort of figuring out which is which. There's no Word tablet in the second one, but it still is one. So, and this applies across all kinds of resources, right? So our data scientist, and actually several data scientists over the years as we're refining this model, have worked on classifying all of these thousands and thousands and thousands of different resources into a recognizable set of categories for our donors to be able to select projects. And this is, I just did a quick look at what's live on our site right now. And I wanted to highlight that there's a small group of projects, a relatively small group of projects where teachers are requesting musical instruments. A lot of people might want to support musical instruments, right? Music helps kids learn math and so on and so forth. But it would be hard without this taxonomy and without the search capability on our website to find those. They're sort of a needle in the haystack. But because we have taxonomy in place, we've been able to fund those music projects in all 50 states this year. 664 in California. So that's a bit on machine learning. So now I'm going to talk about data analysis. And you may be wondering, what about the pandemic, right? So this is the analysis that I'm going to share. I want to just emphasize that this is all sort of you're hearing hot off the presses live action analyses. So I want to start by setting the stage. We can think back to March. It feels like so long ago. But on March 24th, Idaho closed their public schools, a recommended closure. But they were the last state in the nation to do that. And many people had been expressing concerns that coronavirus would further widen educational inequity because not every child has the same resources at home to learn with. Not every child has the same high-speed internet access or computers or et cetera, right? And so as an organization dedicated to supporting teachers and kids, it felt like a bit of an emergency, right? So the team thought, what can we do to help keep kids learning from home? And our first iteration, right, of just what are we going to do was not our usual project model where we ship resources to schools, right? Like that's not going to work if the schools are closed. So as a first step, we said, we're just going to get money to teachers and trust them. I mean, we're going to ask them what they're doing with it, but we're basically going to trust them to do the right thing. So literally 16 days after the last state school closed, DonorsChoose issued $750,000 to teachers to support their students in learning from home. Since then, Keep Kids Learning was going for about a month. We issued over $11 million in total. And here's the very small part that data played in that. So I mentioned the moldy refrigerator. We needed a way to keep track of who had been invited to apply for Keep Kids Learning, who had completed an application, who had received funding. And then we needed to know, like, what else do we know about these teachers and so on. And all of this, this slide is maybe not as polished as some of the other slides because this was our initial emergency response, right? And so for that purpose, we had developed these custom ID lists, a way that was more streamlined, more efficient in terms of actually the time it took to run queries, but also more efficient in terms of the kind of leftover moldy stuff in the fridge going forward. And this was the first big use case of those custom ID lists, that they were used to coordinate the different teachers and how they were participating in Keep Kids Learning. And we got a lot of very positive feedback from teachers. So Ms. Cormani is one example who was just really grateful to be able to deliver packages to her students at home. Okay, so that was the first emergency response. But it wasn't really consistent with our main model, and we didn't think that that was going to be sustainable for the long term. So while we had that project running, we also started up a new thing called distance learning projects. So it's a new project type on the site where teachers did not have to ship to their school. They could ship to themselves or other locations. And it was a way to, again, get resources, right? And you can see we also flagged, like for donors, this is a distance learning project to help donors find the teachers who were trying to address these COVID issues directly. So I was asked to look at how's it going? Do teachers like this new product? And that was the question very broadly, right? And at the highest level, you know, schools closed was something that had not happened in the history of DonorsChoose. I don't know when in the history of the country schools just closed across the country. But essentially, we pivoted and teachers came with us. So you can see on the left here, there are projects submitted in 2019. And you can see there's a bit of a dip from February to March to April, and then a rebound in May. The same thing happened on the right this year in 2020, but it was a much more extreme drop off and a much more extreme comeback. And you can also see that the comeback was in distance learning projects. That was where, for May, people came back. So that was very encouraging. The next question is, were all teachers equally likely to participate? Was this working across the board, or were there other things for us to keep in mind? So the very short answer is no, not all teachers were equally likely to submit distance learning projects. One thing that we found was that our highest need, teachers from our highest need classrooms were more likely to submit distance learning projects. So on the left, there are projects submitted from lowest poverty schools. This is defined in terms of eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. On the right, there are schools where 75% or more of students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And you can see the higher the need, the higher the participation rate in distance learning projects. Similarly, more experienced teachers were more likely to request distance learning projects. So on the left, there are teachers who were new to DonorsChoose this spring. In the middle is teachers who had been with the site for less than 5 years, than 5 or more years. And on the far right are teachers who we invited to participate in Keep Kids Learning, which is sort of a combination of, it was only teachers at very high need schools. And also we selected for teachers who had a lot of experience with the site, had been, participated in all of the sort of gratitude elements and expectations around grants that in their past experience with us. So another thing that differs across distance learning and standard projects has to do with what resources people were requesting, which intuitively makes some sense. So there are some things that are kind of the bread and butter of DonorsChoose, right? Books, educational basics, pencils, notebooks, those kinds of core basic issues were the most common requests for both distance learning projects and standard projects. Technology was much more common request among distance learning projects than standard projects, but it was still sort of the next most common. The biggest difference that really stuck out was in classroom furniture. And that makes some sense, right? Flexible seating, desks, bookshelves, etc. Doesn't make as much sense to order that kind of thing when you're talking about distance learning as when you are talking about a standard project that you're going to implement in a school building, right? So I also was asked to look at geography, and I did that. And this is a very simple chart, but I want to emphasize that I wouldn't be showing you a chart that was this simple if I hadn't done a bunch of modeling behind it to just make sure that, this wasn't, correlation is not causation. There's no causation, but I didn't want to be falling victim to omitted variable bias, right? I didn't want to be showing you if really this is about COVID death rates, or if really this is about some other thing. I threw everything I could think of into a bunch of different models. And what I came up with was that the partisanship of a state and whether a teacher was teaching in an urban school or another school, rural, town, suburban, or unclassified zip codes, was really strongly related to how likely they were to choose a distance learning project versus a standards project. So you can see on the left are cities from states where 55% or more of the people voted for Clinton in 2016. A large majority of those projects were distance learning projects. And on the far right, non-cities from states where more than 55% voted for Donald Trump, a large majority of the projects were standard projects. One more thing. So the data science and analytics team is working primarily with administrative records, with the data sources that I outlined above. We also have a user experience research team. And so while I was being asked to do these analyses of the administrative records, our UX researcher did a survey of teachers to find out, were teachers confused in choosing distance learning or not? Like, to sort of get his sense of how were teachers experiencing this language of distance learning projects versus standard projects. And what he found was, so he asked, if your school were not closed, would you still be posting this project on DonorsChoose? And what he found was, for the people choosing distance learning, about a third of them said, yes, I'd be posting this exact same project. And you can imagine, I want my kids to read Little House on the Prairie, and I want them to read it if they're home or if they're in school. I don't care, but I want them to read that book, right? There's some things that are just going to be the same, right? Another third roughly said, yes, but I'd be requesting different items or resources. So like, I did do some modifications given COVID-19. And about another third said either, no, I'd be posting an entirely different project, or I wouldn't be using DonorsChoose at all if it weren't for COVID-19. In contrast, the people who chose standard projects, 88% of them said, yes, I would be posting this exact project, regardless of whether the school closed. And to me, that suggests a thinking that is aligned with messages around COVID-19 is not really a thing, is a hoax, is a whatever, particularly when taken in combination with the patterns of partisanship that I'm seeing in the data. So what does that mean we're going to actually do, right? So that's all very interesting. Our president has a bully pulpit. Teachers are operating in a culture just like the rest of us. Fine, but what are you going to do about that? And again, this is, hot off the presses, all very much in process still. But what I can tell you is, literally like earlier today, I got a Slack that we're no longer going to call distance learning projects. They're just going to be projects, and people who are working with students at home will submit a project using this kind of delivery system, and other people will use a different kind of delivery system. We want to be flexible to meet teachers where they're at and to continue to be an inclusive force for educational equity. And we will keep iterating and keep improving as we go. And I'd love to hear what you all think.
Rebecca, thank you for that discussion and engaging information. Are there any questions from the audience? Or I know I have a question. I'll just start. So Rebecca, how are you measuring the impact of DonorsChoose and your support during distance learning? There is one statistic out there that distance learning is just reaching 20% of public school students. And we have a high number, maybe in transitional housing or other situations like that, that it's not even reaching the students. So what are your metrics here of success, and how do you feel about that statistic?
I mean, yeah, how I feel about that statistic, broadly speaking, in the world is it's devastating. How I feel about that in terms of DonorsChoose is, our mission was never to be a replacement for a public education system. And I think we reach on the order of 1% of students. And one of the things, the study that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, one of the really exciting things that they found was that trusting teachers to identify the needs of their students and then funding them does have a measurable impact. That study obviously was completed is based on data from before coronavirus. But my feeling is that that principle still holds. And so I guess my answer is, we are not a replacement for the education system at all. We don't want to be, we won't be, right? But we can make it a little bit better by really listening to what teachers say they need. And I feel like that is especially important in this moment when so much is unknown about even what education can look like, right? And so much is unknown about the coronavirus and et cetera, et cetera.
When you say more experienced teachers, how do you define that, Rebecca? When you say more experienced teachers.
Yeah, that's a great question. What I mean is more experienced with DonorsChoose. So I just broke people down into categories of like, did they create their account with us in the last few months, or was it within the last 5 years, or have they been working with our site for more than 5 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. So when you say experienced, you mean not experienced as a teacher, experienced with your platform?
Yes. I mean, there's some correlation, right? Because they can't use our platform if they're not a teacher, but it's not the same thing.
Okay. So do you have any insights regarding the level of experience of the teacher and where they are in their career and their likelihood to use the DonorsChoose platform or their passion for it? I mean, some have argued here in New York City, there is certainly a range of teachers. And there's some people that are extremely passionate about what they do. Maybe they're not as far along. Some people maybe less so. Some have correlated experience with being less passionate in New York City. I'm not saying that's correct, but what insights do you have on experience through the lens of experience in your profession, as opposed to experience with DonorsChoose? In other words, are the people that should be using, that would be most, how can I say, that had the most experience in teaching, you would think they would be running to your platform. Is that true? What are your thoughts there?
In all honesty, I haven't looked at that. It's a really interesting question. And I do have, we have some data on the experience of the teachers who use our site. I don't know off the top of my head of a good comparison data set for the country, although I bet that NCES might have one. Yeah, I might look into that. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer though right this moment.
No worries there. Are there any other questions from the audience at all? Any questions?
This is Josephine Jimo. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
I guess I do have a question. I taught middle school math for the past school year, and while it wasn't a private school, I have a background in distance learning that goes back, quite a number of years. And my current curiosity has to do with the use of technology by teachers who were kind of thrown into this situation because of the pandemic. And I'm very interested in, I've been hearing about how difficult it's been for teachers to make the transition from brick and mortar to virtual for any of a number of reasons. And I have heard of situations where both sometimes students will say, well, it's not a brick and mortar school. I'm not, this is not real school. I'm not going to do work. But I've also heard of situations where, for reasons that I would love to know more about, there have been teachers who either reduced the amount of instruction they actually gave in a classroom, or in some cases ceased doing instruction at all. And I'm just wondering if anyone if you, Rebecca, or anyone else on the call has any insights into that, or maybe can even point me into a direction where I can learn more about some of those. It's a kind of a once in a lifetime situation that we're in, because we've never really been in this pandemic and in this particular set of conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess so I presented some of these findings to our board, and the DonorsChoose board has some teachers on it. And so there were a number of different questions, and people were asking, what about this? And did you control for that? And, for all of them, except this teacher, I could say, yeah, that's a great question. Here's the data set I used. Here's how I controlled for what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. But what the teacher said to me was, she's a teacher in Chicago, and she said, once the school closed, they would not let me in my classroom. So even just materials that I would ordinarily use, even if I had, which I did, she was perfectly comfortable using Zoom and video conferencing and whatever, but she also had been teaching for a number of years, and she teaches, I think, kindergarten, and so she has just a lot of props and whatever materials that she's used to using to teach that she literally physically was not allowed to access, right? And she said, do you know, are other schools literally locking teachers out of the building? I finally got to go into my school building. And of course, one of the sources of information that I use is a website called Ed Weekly. I think they have some of the best information available, but there's a lot that is being left up to individual schools and school districts and teachers, and it's very difficult to know. I'm sure there's a breadth of experiences and approaches and pressures and skills and ideas and all of those things. And I don't have the information to be able to speak to that breadth of experience. I do know that it's very difficult for everyone and unprecedented, as you said.
What trends are you anticipating or do you anticipate for the upcoming school year? And what do you see as the future of distance learning based on whatever information has come in the way of data from this past year?
So I'm really reluctant to make predictions without a lot of strong historical data, which I do not have for global pandemics. Yeah, exactly. Or without a crystal ball. I think the concerns that a number of people, including people at DonorsChoose, have been raising about the risk of expanded educational inequity are real. And, I hope that communities can come together, that donors can come together, and that we can support teachers and students to, I'm sorry, to keep kids learning, I wish I had a simple answer, and I don't. It's very, very difficult. And I've heard, there's a ton of predictions about who will, when will schools open? How will they open? What are the right? And I just, I try to read them, but they change. And a lot of them, Ed Weekly is a site that I trust for information about that, but a lot of it is states saying we're going to leave it to the districts to decide, and yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
No, I was just curious. The distance learning thing is like new to everybody. It's new to, of course, the kids pick it up like right away. And I would imagine that it's, even though the schools only shut down from about March, April, May, June, so that's 4 months, a 4-month trajectory. They're going to have 2 months off, and then they're going to come back up. The teachers will probably get a few weeks to like cool off, but then there will be like a month or so that they start to like think about making things easier for themselves, or making more engagement for the kids, making it easier to actually communicate to them. But I was just curious to see whether you saw a trend line going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. There's a lot of ideas about having kids come back in shifts so that it's possible to be socially distant. I know we've had teachers requesting air filters for schools that have classrooms with no windows and bad ventilation. I mean, there's just like, I think teachers and schools are having to think about education and distance learning. They're also having to think about public health in a way that they maybe haven't had to think about in the past. And, it's not like anyone is dumping a ton. I mean, anyway.
Okay.
Well, I will pause my editorializing.
There's some more learning to come there. In your presentation, you mentioned that you're supporting the classroom with donations in the box. We saw the boxes, but you also mentioned tangible support for teachers in making the transition to distance learning. So this isn't really a data question, but was there some sort of professional development offering for them to help teachers make that shift? Or was it just, they made the shift and then they just started to make the request? Did you offer them some sort of professional development experience so that they could more easily make the transition?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know it's something that people have talked about at the organization and is still under discussion. Our model, generally speaking, is more bottom up, that we're like a tech startup in New York City, right? We don't know what's going to necessarily be the most useful to somebody teaching, literature to third graders in St. Louis. But that said, maybe there are some things we could offer about technology as a tech company, right? So it's complicated. So our model is more has been more prioritizing and lifting up the voices of what teachers say they want, more than trying to drive a central agenda or training platform or whatever. But maybe this is a moment when we really do have some things that would be useful for us to offer centrally other than money. So it's I know it's under discussion. I don't have an answer though right now.
I wonder if an offering like that, maybe something online, would also be good for marketing purposes with your donors. To be able to say, not only are you offering valuable support, but we're helping teachers, get the most out of it. That it would be more of a marketing tool that would drive more donations.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting idea. And I do think that, there might be partners also who have well-developed curricula for this kind. It's outside of the data team's work, but I know it's under discussion.
No, I'm sure. Yeah. No, I'm stretching things a bit. Absolutely. Any other questions from the audience? Anyone at all? Have we covered all the questions?
Yeah, actually I have a question. I was just curious, did you notice any difference in sort of the percentage of projects that were fully funded during this time at all?
Yeah, I mean, causality is a little tricky, but yes, distance learning projects were getting funded more quickly than standard projects by and large in this time. Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting. Any other questions there?
I have a question about the your red state, blue state COVID slide. I recognize that the answer to this is probably, it's too soon to know. But I'm curious if you had seen any shifts in that distribution as the epicenters of COVID moved from typically cities, typically more democratic focused, to more rural areas, more right-wing areas.
So I was not, I don't feel that I have data I can trust to really assess that at this point. There was, I'm sure you've heard of this, Nick, that the story of the data scientist who got fired in Florida for putting out, right? Like, so I did a one-time, like, here's what Johns Hopkins has to say by state, and just kind of threw that in. Not ideal. It's a really interesting question, and I think the challenge is because we're going to move away from distance learning projects as a separate thing. This was sort of a moment in time to be able to assess that, and then, you know, it's not really like, we want teachers to get what they need, and if some teachers are alienated by that language, it's not worth it to us, you know. Professional development might be worth it to us. How we talk about equity, that's worth it to us to alienate people, right? But do we call it distance learning projects? Who cares, you know? But that does mean that we're losing a data collection opportunity. So. But I guess if historical data becomes available, I mean, it's an interesting question.
Any other questions from the group? Any other? Okay, so if we've covered all the questions, Rebecca, thank you again. Engaging talk, inspiring us with all that you do to support teachers in this.
Thank you so much. It's very, very kind of you. I'm glad to be here.
Challenging times. So thank you for lifting up our teachers and our students,
Thank you.
and for joining us tonight. Thank you all for coming tonight. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.